My name is John Shaw, and I am the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. And I'd like to thank you for joining our series, Understanding Our New World. And as we try to explore the international implications of this crisis, there's probably no one we could better ask to help us sort through it than today's guest, Ambassador Jan Eliasson, who's joining us from Stockholm, now Thursday evening in Sweden. So let me just tell you a little bit about the ambassador. Jan has done basically everything you can do in Swedish diplomacy and government. He's been an advisor to the prime minister. He's been an ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to the US. He's been the deputy foreign minister, and then he's also been the foreign minister, which is equivalent to our Secretary of State. On the global stage, again, Jan has done about everything. He's been president of the UN General Assembly, a one-year rotating presidency, and he's also been the Deputy Secretary General of the UN for 4 years. Jan's, one of his many areas of expertise is mediation, has mediated a number of international conflicts, including spending a couple of years trying to help end the Iran-Iraq war, and in the course of that spent about 25 hours in small group negotiations with Saddam Hussein. He has some stories from that will make it difficult to sleep at night, I'll say. But I should say, in the spirit of full disclosure, I know Jan quite well. In fact, 15 years ago, I wrote a book about him, which I'm going to show you right here. It's called The Ambassador: Inside the Life of a Working Diplomat. And for the book, what the premise was I was trying to describe what a modern ambassador does. And I thought that it made sense to just find a really good ambassador and to shadow that ambassador over a period of time. So as John will quickly attest, we spent many, many hours together talking about his career, about diplomacy. I had the chance to watch him work in Washington, saw him travel to the Midwest, actually gave a great speech in Milwaukee. I spent a week in Sweden meeting with diplomats who had worked with Jan. So the ambassador has, as I say, has done about everything. I should also add, before I turn to him, he has some very serious Midwestern roots. When he was a high school student, he spent a very interesting year in Decatur, Indiana, and kind of the heart of the Midwest, and was part of a foreign exchange group. And I know over the years, I would hear him giving speeches about life on the international stage, and a lot of references to Decatur, Indiana would crop up. So Jan, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you again. And let's maybe start out by talking about where you're at now, Sweden, because Sweden, as you may know, has been written about a lot in the context of the current crisis. And there's seems to be a lot of dispute exactly what the government's policy is and how Swedes believe it's being implemented. And I know you're not a member of the government, but tell us a little bit about how this COVID-19 crisis looks to you from your home in Stockholm.
Well, first of all, John, thank you very much for inviting me. We are old friends, and it was easy for me to accept to have this conversation with you. I think the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute is doing very important work, celebrating also a very, very good senator that I saw at a distance mostly, but I admired very much. Also, thank you for, if I may be a bit ironic, for this reminder of my age. Listed everything I had been doing. I was thinking, was that me? But I want to tell you, I just thought about that when you asked about the pandemic affecting the world and Sweden. That in fact, when I was 17 years old, crossing the Atlantic to Decatur, Indiana, we were 800 students on board, 400 brought to the United States the Asian flu. It spread over the boat in a horrible way, and sadly enough, one Greek boy died. And we stayed in quarantine in New York. At that time, the boats docked at the west side, and we stayed a couple of days only, probably not enough. And then we spread this Asian flu, 1957, to America. It's in medical history noted that the Arosa Sky from Rotterdam to a great degree brought Asian flu to the United States.
Oh my God.
I had flew to the football team. One of the best football players in the Decatur high school team was my so-called brother in the family, and he spread it to the team. So my my start in the indicator was not that popular and successful in the beginning. It turned out better in the end because I was elected vice president of the senior class at the end. But anyway, so to go back to your question, of course, it has affected us like everyone else. I think that is the unique feature of this pandemic, that it strikes everybody and it strikes very, very quickly. And I think that explains the enormously strong reaction in the world and the almost explosive character of the pandemic, in not only in the area of health, but also in the area of economy and social life, as we all see. My country has chosen a policy which is based very much on voluntary measures and steps. I am over 70, as you understand, and I'm asked to be avoiding meeting other people, which my wife and I do. Fortunately, we have a dog that we walk every day in a long, wonderful walk. But it is all voluntary. We are also not advised to go to other parts of the country, but it's not compulsory. You do what you find to be the right thing to do. We did not close the schools. We thought and still think that younger children don't get for COVID-19 as quickly as others, which is correct. And that made it possible for nurses and teachers and others to stay at work and not stay home with their children, as was the case of those who closed. But I must say, I am disturbed by the high rate of mortality. We have 3,400 dying out of a population of 10-some million, and that's pretty high. I think the weakness is the fact that the pandemic entered the old age homes. 75% of those who died are in that category, or over 70. But still, it shows that we neglected the risks of people visiting the old age homes, and that staff working there were not sufficiently prepared for the task. So the jury is still out whether this was a successful one or not. The good thing is that we live a relatively normal life. We don't notice that much. Economic life is going on as much as we can. Markets are disappearing in some cases, of course. And we notice certain deficiencies in the supply of goods coming into the country. But we have a degree of normality, which I think is higher than others. And generally, I found that, strangely enough, when you live in a time of abnormal circumstances, you tend to want to restore normality. So we tried to stick to our old routines, and I am now chair of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, by the way. We are this week organizing one of the world's biggest conferences on peace and development with the methods of modern communications, the Zoom and the Skype and the whatever method you have. So we are adapting relatively well, and morale is still pretty high in our country. But of course, the uncertainty about the future is, of course, bearing noticed very much. And I think if we don't get more clarity on the success of developing a vaccine, I think we will be feeling this pandemic more strongly if this goes on and on.
Well, Jan, is there a sense, I know it's hard to characterize a national mood, but is there the sense that maybe Sweden has weathered the storm, or does this feel more like the front edge of a number of storms? I mean, obviously the economic collapse in the United States is going to have ripple effects. I know there's reports that the EU is going to suffer a major economic contraction. You know, Swedes are so tightly linked to the global economy, to the European economy. Is there a sense that some very, very difficult, at least economic and probably public health challenges are still to be confronted?
We hope that the pandemic, the worst part of the pandemic is soon going to be over, because the rates of death are going down rather visibly in the Stockholm area, the capital area. And the rest of the country, as you know, who know my country well, the cities are pretty far spread out, and the population, I mean, we are the size of France, and we have 10 million people. So we hope very much that it will not spread as easily as in big cities than people who live very closely to each other. So there is hope now that we could ease things up in terms of health, the health side. But of course, we feel very strongly and growingly the economic effects. Industries we find are so dependent on supply chains from abroad, and the most surprising effects on what happens in a country which is hard hit and where you can't reach through normal transportation, this country, you'd notice the interdependence, which was it was taken for granted for so long. And now we notice that this interdependence is also showing that we are sitting in the same boat. And Europe is, of course, now very much has to face up to our own integration efforts. Already before the pandemic, John, Europe was having a difficult time. We had to struggle with the Brexit, the Brits leaving us. We had to struggle with migration, which we couldn't formulate a common policy, which I regretted very much. And we had even doubts about the democratic institutions in countries like Hungary and Poland. Such a debate was rather damaging to the idea of European integration. And then comes the pandemic. And in the beginning, I must say, I was very disappointed when I saw that when Italy was hard struck in the beginning, there was very little, if any, assistance going to Italy. Because it was, as we said in the beginning, striking people everywhere and everybody, and people naturally, politicians naturally, I must say, cared for their own population first and saw that we didn't have enough masks or whatever it was. And Italy didn't get any support. And that was not good for the idea of European solidarity. Now, I think there is an improvement underway because there is a huge financial package being negotiated. It's not yet concluded, but I would be surprised if it doesn't come out with strong signals of support of those who are hard hit. So we have a problem, a combination of a health problem and an economic and social problem. And also growingly, I must say, growingly a psychological problem because, you know, sitting alone, being isolated, closing borders, even inside Europe, and closing contacts between in society, in your private life, not hugging your grandchildren. There is something happening which we have to watch out. And I noticed today that the Secretary General of the UN was passing on a warning from WHO, World Health Organization, that they should also look at the mental health situation that is evolving. If you think of a child of 2, 3, 4 years old who understands what's going on, what's happening, in many cases not going to school, not being able to see their grandparents and so forth. There is something happening that we have to watch out for on a deeper sense. But all in all, it's a challenge, and there are two ways to go. Either we go the road of cooperation and realize that we are in this together, or we go and we look inward and look at the outside world as a problem. We demonize merchandise from abroad, we demonize ideas from abroad, we demonize people from abroad, migrants, refugees. And if that political philosophy gains, then I think we are in trouble. So I think if you want to defend the classic liberal democratic values, we have to watch out now and make sure that we think not only about how we deal with the corona crisis in our daily life and in our societies, our own countries, but also we ask ourselves what kind of world, what kind of countries do we want to live in post-corona, after corona?
Right. Yeah, and I know you were at the UN during a couple of infectious disease incidents. I think 2005, you were president of the General Assembly when the avian flu arose, and then you were Deputy Secretary General in 2013, 14, 15 when the Ebola crisis. Tell me about your experience of the UN then. Did the UN respond in a coherent, organized, aggressive way? Talk about those two historical examples, and then we'll focus on current circumstances.
Well, I want to say that when I look back at my time as president of the UN General Assembly 2005 and 6, and when I look back at my time as Deputy Secretary General between 2012 and 16, I must say that we reacted relatively quick and well and in a unified manner on both those situations. 2005 was the avian flu. And I remember so well, it sounds like a serious case of name dropping, but President Bush came to New York and he paid a courtesy call to me, believe it or not, as president of the General Assembly. And half the time we spoke about the avian flu. He was extremely worried about it, although the avian flu at that time, I don't think had hit the US, it was mostly in Asia, Vietnam and China, I think. And he was asking me all the time what can be done. And he spoke very warmly about WHO, World Health Organization. And he also later became extremely popular among the Africans because he instituted a program for developing countries in Asia and Africa on health issues. So, and there was a security, and then later on when I became Deputy Secretary General, we saw the Ebola crisis and we needed a real strong sign from the Security Council to take this pandemic seriously. Also as a signal of its political significance, because the resolutions of the Security Council are binding, in contrast to the resolutions from the General Assembly, which are only recommendations. So we went to the council and they came out with a very good support with the resolution commending those who support and also encouraging others to come in stronger. And that was a very good reaction. I remember also how people were reminding us of what Richard Holbrooke did when the AIDS problems arose in the 80s. He brought that issue in the 90s when he was UN ambassador to the Security Council. It was sensational. And what he did by that and what we did by continuing to put pandemics of Asian flu and Ebola on the Security Council agenda was that we sent a message that in today's world, you cannot see security only in military terms. During the Cold War, we got so used to seeing everything in military and political dimensions. But now, for me, looking back at my many years in diplomacy and international relations, I say the security threats come from so many directions today. They come from climate change. They come from pandemics. They come from cybersecurity. A lot of the new threats are of the character that they don't fit into the military and political traditions of the discourse in the Security Council. And that's why I'm, of course, as you understand, very sad and disappointed that the Security Council this time around, when the pandemic of the COVID-19, the corona, is so obviously hurting economic, socially, and I would say politically, nations, look at the relationship China and the US, for instance, that they haven't come out with the resolution. It is a deep disappointment. It was presented by Secretary General Guterres very wisely in the beginning of the pandemics entering a dramatic phase. And I would have thought that the Security Council would jump at this because he proposed that the Council should stand by a recommendation to introduce ceasefires in all conflict areas in the world while we deal with this global pandemic. Very reasonable, and a very good reason also for parties to conflict to save face by accepting a pause in their fighting. And here we are, 2 or 3 months later, with still no resolution. The latest reason, US claiming that they didn't want to subscribe to a mention of WHO as being an organization of use in this situation, which is a rather absurd explanation in my view.
Yeah, and let's talk about the WHO because it's, for those of us who are not as schooled in the UN, I mean, it obviously is a technical agency within the UN family. Two things. One, I mean, how does it work with the rest of the UN system? And secondly, I was stunned to read that its overall budget is something like less than $5 billion, which, as one writer said, is smaller than really large hospitals in the United States. I mean, tell me about just the relative limited funding to it, and also how it fits into the overall UN system.
Well, I have followed the UN from several directions, and one should recognize that when you are sitting, like I have done a lot in New York as Undersecretary General and Deputy Secretary General from headquarters, people don't quite realize that the specialized agencies are relatively, or I would say very much, independent. They have their own boards and they have their own routines, which are very much worked out by themselves. And it's hard to lead them from the center. I've worked with 4 or 5 secretaries general, and I felt their frustration. The Boutros Ghali talked about being the Pope in the medieval times when the local archbishops were running things, you know. But anyway, so they are independent, and one of the weaknesses I must admit that I see in the organization is that there are very strong regional entities inside the WHO, and they are very much a powerful group. And then, of course, the membership is very important to the organizations because they are supported not by mandatory contributions, but by voluntary contributions. So the member states, unfortunately, often try to exercise influence on the specialized agencies. And of course, that has probably been the case also in the case of WHO. But all in all, I must say, having followed WHO in my own experience with the avian flu and with the Ebola, I think they're doing a very good job. And they are not doing a job only with the pandemics, like now in the corona times, but also with tuberculosis, with polio, with vaccines, with training, with a number of research-oriented areas where they are the global catalysts. And it is very important that we, yes, recognize that any organization needs to reform and refurbish, but we also must realize that when you are in the midst of a crisis, an organization is put under the strongest strain, we should rather try to support them and help them in this situation rather than criticize them to a degree that they are almost politically immobilized.
In terms of the paralysis of the UN and the Security Council, is it largely because the US and China, to a lesser extent, the US and Russia are at loggerheads on this issue, and that is just preventing the permanent 5 to move forward aggressively?
Well, I was 5 years Deputy Secretary General, and I can tell you, John, that I was frustrated and disappointed and expressed this to my colleagues and to myself every day practically. That was the Syria war that went on and on and on, absolutely unnecessarily, because it was a conflict that was affected by not only the parties on the ground, which could not agree, of course, but also the countries in the region, not least Saudi Arabia and Iran having different views and supporters in the area. Turkey and Qatar were involved also, but then also US and Russia being on different sides. So we could never get a strong tool in the hand of Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura, Gay Peterson now, who were great negotiators, but who were not given the tool to work because of the difficulty among the major actors. And in today's world, I'm very sad to see that the deterioration of relationship between US and China is going so fast, and it's very, very dangerous. Already before we saw the problems in the trade area, South China Sea, territorial issues, Taiwan policy, human rights, of course, rightly so, Hong Kong, the different minorities in the countries. All this was there, but now when you see the COVID-19 being used by both sides, but now most recently, of course, in the democratic scene in your country, as a tool in the domestic political debate, then it's getting very dangerous because this could easily spread into other areas of the whole relationship, not least in the Security Council. The reason why this resolution did not go through in the beginning was differences between US and China. Now, evidently, most recently, China has agreed. France is trying to push it still. Even today, while we speak, I think there are attempts to bring that resolution to life. But it was because of these tensions between the most important countries in the world. And I think we would hope that the two most powerful countries in the world should see that it is not only in the interest of the international scene and national atmosphere that they try to agree on such a thing as a pandemic, but it's also in their own interest. A great cooperation now on vaccines, for instance, or how to deal with this crisis is a very important sign of wanting to accept an international perspective on security, which I'm really asking for and which is absolutely necessary that we do.
Jan, we had a speaker a couple of weeks ago, David Kennedy, a historian, who reminded us that after, in the US, the Great Depression and World War II, there was this whole flurry of creative institution creation. And I know the Swedes were active in this too, in terms of creating the UN, World Bank, IMF, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization. Do you see any signs that, after this crisis passes, that something new and better is going to emerge? Or is it just making current institutions work? What do we need, new institutions or make current ones work?
It's a very important question. I often think of the period 1930 to 1945 approximately as the darkest moment of history, even all of history. If you add up the horrors of the fascism and Nazism to Stalinism and to Holocaust and 50 million people killed in the Second World War, just one black, dark cloud all over. In 1945, you rose up and here comes the UN Charter, which is still here at the table, believe it or not. It wasn't planned. It wasn't planned, it's here. In San Francisco 45, you have the Universal Declaration 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt playing a wonderful role. You have the Refugee Convention 51. You had the Geneva Conventions also established. You had the beginning of the European Union. The Coal and Steel Union was the beginning of the European Union. All these institutions were set up to guarantee that we would go the international road, that we would integrate, and that we would cooperate. When I entered as a young diplomat the Foreign Service in 1965, I came in on that wave of, leaving that horror behind and accepting the liberal democracy, accepting the UN Charter principles, everybody's equal worth, the rule of law, helping nations that were less fortunate, and of course, avoiding always that scourge of war, which is mentioned in the preamble of the Charter. So my whole diplomatic life was doing that, and I never thought in my life that I now would sit in a situation and defend these institutions and defend multilateralism, defend international cooperation, because we have seen, particularly influenced by the migration and refugee issues, a trend of identifying the outside world as a problem. We have seen people seen as a problem, as I mentioned earlier, when they come in and in too high numbers and influence the domestic political debate, refugees, migrants. You see in protectionism, merchandise, jobs being taken away, quotation mark. And you have seen it in the form of ideas, be scared of democratic ideas coming in or different ideologies being fought or cherished. So we have now a situation where I think we have to recognize that if we are to be successful in creating a world still based on these principles that guided us after the Second World War, we need also to refurbish and reform our organizations. I'm the first one to say that I'm disturbed about reforms not being carried out in the UN, that the veto power was used far too generously and liberally, and that also we in our international cooperation did not quite see the importance of equality. The inequalities not only between countries, but the inequalities inside countries are very damaging, and has hurt the credibility of organizations, not only international, but your own organizations, your political leaders, your parties, if these, if things are not improving socially and economically. You are stuck on a lower level, and others are, you know, earning a lot of money and capital is accumulated. We need to see the importance of equality as a safety, as a security measure. And therefore, I think when we go back to the situation, when we go to the situation post-corona, we must accept the principle that I was part of establishing when I was Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs. After earthquakes and landslides of huge magnitude, we had a principle that we called, we have to build back better. Build back better. When you saw from the Haiti landslide, earthquake, how people, the houses just disappeared, you had to understand that you can't have that again. So when we now look at the pandemics of the corona, which is horribly, a horrible burden for many, and a chagrin and a grief factor of enormous magnitude, we should still remember that gives us a chance to say, what kind of world do we want to build after the corona? Are we willing to look into inequalities? Are we willing to really face up to the climate change issues, take them seriously, see that there is a link between the pandemic and the climate change through the fact that we have not established peace with nature? Animals, plants, human beings are one, and we should really carefully analyze that relationship. Are we willing to go into that stage and create better institutions or improve the institutions that we have to such a degree that they take care of something which is absolutely crucial today, namely improving the trust factor? We live in a world with a huge trust deficit, and that trust deficit is exploited by forces who want to tear down these institutions. And we therefore have to be very self-critical about how we organize our own societies, both at home and abroad. And I see that as one of the few positive factors in these situations, that we should gather people around the table, talk about what kind of world, what kind of country we want to have after Corona.
Well, Jan, you've been coming to the United States for many years. You've lived here. You have a daughter who lives here. You know this country very well. It's not uncommon to read analysts from Europe and elsewhere saying they don't even recognize the United States right now, particularly in terms of its, well, both of all, in terms of its competence to manage this crisis domestically, but particularly its reluctance to reach out to the rest of the world and try to build a coalition of problem solving. So as a friend and also a astute outside observer, what are you seeing happening in the United States right now?
Well, first of all, I want to say to you how much I love this country, how much I love the United States. I came there as a 17-year-old boy. I grew up in a family, and I called the father and mother there dad and mom, and it's still my family. I still call my classmates when I want to take the temperature of American debate. I call, and I have lived altogether 16 years in the United States. And during my voyage, diplomatic voyage, I've always been siding with the strongest democratic actors, the strongest proponents of human rights. And I always found that in the United States and with my American colleagues and friends and diplomats. So therefore, I can't hide from you that I am, of course, extremely disappointed that this work on building up those structures, international structures, has been made so much more difficult with the most important democracy in the world, the United States, leaving the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, leaving the migration compact that was concluded 2016, leaving even, believe it or not, the Human Rights Council, a democracy that leaves the Human Rights Council because of the membership not being acceptable to them. United Nations is a mirror of the world as it is, unfortunately not a mirror of the world as it should be, but we must still fight for the world as it should be. And to see this development now, to me, brings out the question which I will point also to Europe and my own problems in seeing Europe's future, because we have a situation now where I think democracy is being tested. I think democracy is tested as the best method of running a society. And if we are not attractive as democratic societies to the outside world, then the tendencies to look for authoritarian leaders, even totalitarian systems, will grow. And I think for me, everything builds on the fact that the most important word in the world is actually the word together. You can't create a good future if you don't take into account others. If we are to build a good, strong United Nations, we need not only the support of governments and parliaments, we need the private sector, we need the think tanks, we need organizations like yours, we need the academic world. We need this mobilization around a goal which brings in a popular support of your efforts. The first three words of this charter is "we the peoples." And we have to make sure that this is a meaningful, the kind of work that we are talking about, building the new world after Corona, has to be built on this together, the concept of together. Not only of idealistic reasons, but simply for survival reasons. So I would very much hope that we would do our best now to improve democracy, because Europe has similar problems to the United States. We are discussing the health of our democracies. We are discussing how Europe will go on with this polarization around migrants and refugees. And we are sad to see the Brits leave the European Union. So I think US and Europe, which are now the ones representing most strongly the Western liberal democracy, have to do an extraordinary amount of work to create that process of building back better. But it's important that we do so, because otherwise we open up to forces that could lead us in a very dangerous direction.
As you see the problems and challenges, to what extent is it a leadership problem? Is it an institution problem? Is it a citizen problem? Obviously, all three are part of it. But what are the elements that need to be improved for this vision that you're articulating to go forward?
Well, it's easy to start with the personal leadership, the political leadership, and of course we should never underestimate that, the role model syndrome and the fact that you have a political mandate to go in a different direction. But I also think we need to think of why certain tendencies are being supported and what we can do to improve trust. If we don't have trust in institutions, if we have lack of knowledge about the importance of the outside world, then we must go back to such basic things as education and training, and make sure that the world is part of your own country's agenda, and that you also mobilize the most important sectors in society. For me, an untapped resource is young people. I go to my grandchildren's schools these days, 15-year-old, 11-year-old. My wife tells me I'm rejuvenated when I get back from it, because I'm so filled with hope. They know what difference between right and wrong. They know about taking care of the climate. They know about ending wars so that people can thrive and all that. I come back and say, my God, they have it instinctively. So we should learn to work with young people, not only for young people. We should work for young people also, but also with them. And then women. the strongest the strongest positive force in the world today should be women. They never had the chance to be completely emancipated. Now it's coming. And if we let that force really come in, I've seen it in peace negotiations when I bring in women, that they add a human dimension, a dynamic force. And you look at the best countries who are handling the pandemic crisis, they are run by women, by the way, if I make a light analysis. But I think there is a combination of factors of coming back to mobilizing a lot of goodwill. People want to do well, do good. And we should bring that out among young people and women. And we should try to work out an education system which really brings in the world to our schools and our educational institutions. And I think, again, your institute can play an important role in that regard.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to some questions. I've gotten a lot of questions to you, and I've tried to integrate them into my questions, but let me read 2 or 3 of them and have you kind of respond. First one is from Gail in Carbondale, wondering, does the world consider the United States the world leader now? Or does it consider it a leader sort of on par with China? How does the world, and again, hard to find, what is the global perception of the US right now?
No, I must admit that there was no hesitation about US being the leader of the Western democratic world up until the most recent occupant of the White House. But the many signals coming from that house on not only cooperation internationally, climate change, migration, even human rights, as I mentioned, but also the signals towards minorities or different groups, and the attacks, I must say very openly, on the free press. I never thought in my life that I would hear an American president speak about media as being enemies of the people. It is a term that was used, I think, by Stalin, Lenin first and then Stalin. And to hear that being said about an absolutely crucial part of any democratic society, the question of free speech. We come back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I also have here, by the way, at my table. Then that has brought doubts about that. Still, there is a void because Europe is not very strong right now because of the reasons I mentioned: Brexit, migration, uncertainties, and so forth. So there is just hope that there will be in the American society such strong forces that will remind us of what America stood for. I was an exchange student, and I came, as I said, to the port of New York in July 1957. My family had emigrated to the United States, my mother's side, from left complete utter poverty in Sweden, and left for, later on it turned out to be Michigan. I knew that my family had been there at the Statue of Liberty at Ellis Island. So I asked the crew of the ship to wake me up at 5 o'clock in the morning when we entered, because I wanted to see the Statue of Liberty. And I was there, and believe it or not, she was only 100 yards away or so, this 46-meter high bronze beauty. And I was standing there in awe, and then I found out what was on the inscription of the statue. And I had that with me my whole life. And when I left the United Nations 2016, I was asked by a journalist, because President-elect Trump had just been announced and he had won the election. And I was asked by him rather facetiously and not a very good journalistic behavior, what I thought about his migration policies. I was still Deputy Secretary General. So instead of answering the question, I just asked him, the journalist, do you know the inscription of the Statue of Liberty? No, I don't think so. Well, then I'll tell you what it is. Give me your poor. No, give me your tired. Give me your poor. give me your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. So he said, "Is that your answer?" Yes, I said, that's my answer. And that brings out for me the hope and the aspirations and the great admiration we have for this country and what it has done for the world, not least saving the world from Nazism and fascism together with the other allies, including Russia, by the way. But also for always standing up for these basic tenets, basic elements of democracy. And my experience from my high school, from my meetings with senators like Senator Simon, senators, I don't know him so much as many others, as you know, in Washington, and going out in the different states and talking to people in the civil society, in the churches and so forth, I still have belief in the kind of America that we need, not least in the post-corona times.
Yeah, and we have a question from Bill from Chicago, and you touched on it a little bit, but it's about the implications of the U.S. pulling back from the WHO in terms of both practicality and also the symbolism. How significant is this?
Can you repeat that? I didn't get the question.
Well, just the implications of the U.S. Criticizing the WHO, threatening to withdraw funding, that sort of thing. Is this a practical, damaging in a practical sense, symbolic sense, or both?
No, it's of course very damaging to the situation right now. First of all, you have the huge problems of the Chinese-American dispute on how this pandemic came about and was spread. It's a very serious issue, of course, which goes right to the core of political movements and political reactions. So that is one thing. This big cloud of the Chinese-American relationship in the midst of this pandemic crisis. The second one is that whether we accept everything that WHO is doing or not, and I am the one to say that there are deficiencies, we still need that organization desperately right now. And even if they have weaknesses in their structure, we at this moment should support them fully and give them all kinds of assistance so that they can perform the role that they are mandated to do. There is no other organization which has been given the mandate to deal with the global health problems. And we have a global health problem in our societies here at our door, in our houses, in our old age homes. We have to give them that support. Then, of course, it's also important that we develop this vaccine together and to see that the word together is also characterizing the work of dealing with the pandemics. If everyone runs for their own safety and security, yes, it could work short term, but then if another country explodes in the disease or pandemic in your neighborhood or even further away, then it comes back to you. So we are literally sitting in the same boat. We have a responsibility for our brothers and our sisters, and that this is not a question of just idealism or religious belief or whatever. It's a matter of enlightened self-interest. International cooperation is basically a national interest.
Yeah, and one point you made to me a lot over the years was in terms of the UN being about as strong as the member states would allow it to be. Describe a little bit your vision of just how, because as you know, particularly in the US, the UN is oftentimes a target of a lot of criticism, sometimes very sweeping criticism, but describe your view that the UN can only be as strong and as powerful and successful as the countries of the world allow it to be.
Well, I said earlier, and I repeat, that the UN is a mirror of the world as it is, but it is also a mirror of the world as it should be. And if you see the UN as a mirror of the world as it is, you see the many problems of having totalitarian states enter the Human Rights Council, because they are part of the world, whether we like it or not. So when we are criticized, and I've been in that position for so many years, of being criticized, sitting in the headquarters, representing the secretariat, representing the charter, I don't want to look like I'm blaming someone else, but I can't do more to achieve peace in Syria. It gives me muscles as a negotiator to bring about a ceasefire or a beginning of a political process. So that is always the case, that if you don't have among particularly the P5, the permanent five, the 5 key countries in the Security Council, US, Russia, China, France, and UK, if one of them only threatens with a veto, then it goes down, like this COVID-19 resolution. I joked with the permanent 5 members when I left as President of the General Assembly. After a couple of glasses of wine, they asked me, what do you think what you complain so much about the Security Council not delivering? What should we do? They didn't know what they did when they asked me that question, because I said, and first they got very surprised, because I said, I think you should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes. Oh, what do you mean? Well, you should lock yourself up and sit and negotiate a resolution, because you have an interest in yourself coming out with a solution, or at least, an acceptable solution to a problem, rather than say, no, we can't do it, because you're threatened with a veto. You should sit there and you should lock the door, and you should have a sort of a little furnace, and then you should have the white smoke coming out. The resolution is done. That would help the Security Council enormously if using the veto is considered a failure, or even bad taste. Because I think the Security Council is not doing what I as a diplomat am trained to do, namely to negotiate. They often just give up from the beginning and said, we veto, or we threaten with veto. So yes, it is a reflection of the world as it is, and with all the deficiencies, I think if we were to abolish the UN, we would bring a group together and they would try to write a new charter. And in today's world, I'm worried that charter would be much less forward-looking, much less deep on democracy and human rights and rule of law and development than this present one. So if you want to send a word to the researchers and the young people who study international relations, if they want to have a good night's sleep and read something very beautiful, they should read only that 1.5 page of the preamble of the UN Charter, starting with, we the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of wars, which twice in our lifetime has brought sorrow and suffering to mankind. And also to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights in the, now I can't read more, but rule of law and development. It's all there. And that's very inspiring still for me at this advanced age to come back to these sources of inspiration that the Charter is.
Well, Jan, I'd like to conclude by asking you to tell us a little bit about what you're doing as chairman of the Stockholm International Peace Institute. When I've known from you from the time we started talking, you said, I'm never going to retire. Retirement is not a concept that I could really even conceptualize. Tell me what you're doing with the Institute.
Well, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, CIPRI, was created in 1966. Believe it or not, I was a young diplomat helping bring that bill to Parliament to a minister called Alva Myrdal, who is one of my heroes. She became the first chair of CIPRI. It was a gift from the Swedish Parliament to the Swedish people, CIPRI, celebrating 150 years of peace at the time. Today we have 209 years of peace. And I'm now the chair of the CIPRI, so I feel a burden of history on me that to keep this work proceeding very well. We are working with 3 things. We are working with disarmament and believe it or not, John, there are 1,917 billion dollars used for military expenditure in the world every year. Almost half of it's from the United States. China is trailing with about a fourth of that amount. $1,917 billion a year. And if you look at the world, what it looks like health-wise, poverty, development needs, climate change needs, I doubt that these represent the priorities that the people want in this world. The second thing we work with is the broader definition of security. The security is not only military, but also climate change, pandemics, and so forth. And the third thing is to invite dialogues between parties who do not speak to each other. Here I cannot tell you everything we do, but using the fact that Sweden has a tradition of non-alignment and being accepted as partner, as a fair partner in the mediation situations, and CIPRI being an institute with expertise in these different areas, makes us the host for meetings of this nature, where we bring together parties that don't normally speak to each other. So you can imagine that this mix suits me very well. I spend about 30–40% of my time with CIPRI, and that's what my wife accepts at the time. I hope she will continue to do so. I dread the day when I will have nothing to do, you're right. But I will always find something. Problem is I never find time to write, You wrote the book, but I still haven't come about because I'm so engaged in today's situation that I can't think back of looking back at my notes from Iran-Iraq mediation or Darfur or Nagorno-Karabakh, whatever. So, but it's a rich life, and I'm very fortunate and very thankful, very grateful person for what I've been able to do and to able to experience, both privately and professionally.
Great. Well, Jan, thank you so much. And we still hope very much to get you to Carbondale when circumstances allow. And maybe we can have a little detour through Decatur, Indiana, for you to see some of your old friends and your old high school and all.
That's a very attractive option.
Right. Well, Jan, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, and good luck with everything. And to all your participants in this dialogue, thank you for listening partly or wholly to this conversation with an old friend, John.
Great. Thank you so much, Jan. Be well. Take care.
Same to you. Stay healthy.